So, it's been a while. It's been like 2 weeks since I last uploaded a video, which is more than I anticipated, to be honest. Anyway, I'll try and get my uploads back on track starting now. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at a series of 3 levels known as WonderGame. While these levels may not look like much at first, they're actually incredibly well made, even if you don't notice it. There are a lot of cool gimmicks and features that teach the player mechanics without the player actually know that they are being taught. Rather than just using text to tell the player something, WonderGame has more unique ways to give the player information. From the moving platforms in the first level to the lasers in the last level, WonderGame is actually telling you how to play the level and what things to do without you even realizing it. In this video, we will be going over some instances where WonderGame does this really well, and at the end of the video, I will explain how you can use this in your own levels. So before we get into things, I want to let you know that if you like this video and my other videos, please consider subscribing. I only have 243 subscribers as of writing this. Anyway, I won't waste any more of your time. Let's dive right into this. Right off the bat, the level is already teaching us some core mechanics used throughout the trilogy. But rather than having a boring tutorial with text teaching us, it is incorporated into the gameplay. Allow me to explain. Let's take, for example, the use of this animated object seen here on the jump pads. These are used as a staple throughout the trilogy to signify flying and moving objects. This is told to us in the next part, as they are used on flying objects that are unreachable and probably won't kill the player. This lets the player know that these special objects are used for moving and flying objects, and are told to us without posing a threat, so the player learns this without having to use trial and error, which would cause rage. Another instance of this is the moving platforms on chains, starting at 43%. The first time this is used is only to tell the player what they do, which is move in a consistent pattern. They do not pose a threat immediately. However, once they are used again at 48%, they are a little more deadly. However, rather than throwing the player into this part without them knowing the patterns or mechanics of these blocks, they already know what it does, thus are able to effectively play through the part. WonderGame does this a lot throughout the series. This is also commonly done in video game design. They will give you some breathing room to see what a mechanic does, and won't use it against you till after you have an understanding of it. Heck, this is even done in Geometry Dash. Levels such as Background Check and Poltergeist are meant to teach you how to use jump pads and orbs respectively before they are used in complicated gameplay. Anyway, now let's move on to the second level of the trilogy. Starting out quick at 6%, there is this pointy rock thing that falls when it starts pulsing. This is used a few times against the player, but not in the first few instances. Here, it does pulse and then fall, but not in a way to harm the player. This means that the player understands what it does, and when it does it, so when it is used against the player later, the player is more prepared to face it rather than being thrown in blind. We then come across one of my favorite instances of this. Starting at 30%, the player needs to collect some keys in order to not die. This is clearly indicated to the player in the first part, where the keys are easily placed and when collected, open a gateway. This was not made to add difficulty, but was made to tell the player that keys are good and should be collected. With this knowledge, when Evolved Spikes is chasing them in the next part, they know the keys are good, so when they collect them, the wall moves away from the player. Just throwing the player into this part with so much on the screen would probably cause them to die, but because they now understand a little bit about why the keys are there and what they do, they are able to effectively go through the part without feeling overwhelmed. Seriously, I find this part so creative. The keys at the start did not need to be added, but they were so that the player would know that keys will prevent them from dying, helping them out in the next part. This is really good gameplay design. However, there is one little criticism I have for this level. At 72%, there is a rather new mechanic that was not explained yet and is used against us. Not only this, but text appears telling the player to focus. The problem here is, it grabs my attention, and since it appears too late, by the time I finish reading it, I have already died. Rather than use text to tell the player what to do, the mechanic should have been used in a non-fatal way earlier in the level. If the element of surprise was still wanted, the element could have been used non-fatally near the start of the level, so that the player still gets that little bit of shock when the part comes up later, though they are a little more prepared. This means they will get that little surprise, yet the part will be more fair and forgiving. Anyway, on with the third and final level of the trilogy. Remember the flying blocks at the beginning with that certain animated object? Well, they're used again starting at 6%. However, since the player already knows what they do, there is no need to reteach the player. This is good, since it gets the player hyped up, since they are putting their knowledge to the test, which is a good feeling for the final level in the series. Coming up at 17%, we have these moving obstacles. Just like every other part in the level, when introducing a new mechanic, the first few uses of it are not fatal. The players can easily glide through the first instances of it. However, in the second half of this part, they're used in a lot more fatal way. However, since the player now understands how they work and move, they are able to effectively navigate the part a lot more fairly than if they were to be thrown in blind. Next, we have this part starting at 35%. There is this wavy ground which is really confusing at first. Luckily, the first few jumps are easy, and are meant to get the player used to this type of terrain. Later in the part, platforms are added and gameplay becomes harder, but once again, since the player is now used to how the part works, they are able to get past it without many troubles. And finally, one of my favorite parts is the part starting at 69%, where a laser tries to shoot you. The first time the laser shoots, it gives a warning and shoots above the player. This tells the player that the warning means it is going to shoot, as well as tell the player of the danger, that is the laser. After the player understands this mechanic, it is used a lot more fatally. So, that is all the parts I will discuss in this video. Now, let's move on to how you can incorporate this type of gameplay into your levels. When using basic obstacles featured in-game, such as jump orbs and pads, you don't really need to tell the player how they work, since the average Geometry player will already know how. Although, if you add a new mechanic or concept into your level, such as a new game mode or gameplay element, you should give the player a non-fatal section where they can get a basic understanding of the mechanic before it is used in a difficult section or against them. One example of a level that does not do this in a good way is Operation Megan by Agent JDN. Agent JDN adds a custom game mode he called the Springboard. When it is first used, however, it is used in an incredibly difficult section. It is only explained how it works if the player dies, which kind of defeats the point of telling the player. Rather, I believe the first use of this mode should have been in an easy section where the player could learn how it works before they enter a fatal section with it. Agent JDN is really good at making fun custom modes, but the way he uses them doesn't make them very fun for the average player, and only for skilled players that put hundreds of practice attempts into the levels. So if you want to use a custom mechanic on your level, I've outlined 3 golden rules to help you out. Number 1. Teach the player how it works. Don't use text to do this, but rather visually show them in a way that does not put them at risk or allow them to experiment in a risk-free area. Number 2. Avoid distractions. Avoid clogging up the screen with too many things to overwhelm the player. One of the reasons WonderGame was made so well is because it is very minimal, meaning that the player was able to focus on the mechanics. In parts where it was a little overwhelming, the player was taught beforehand what to focus on, so they can ignore that feeling. Number 3. Use the mechanic against them after they know what it does and how it works. Try and use it in a creative and fun way, so that the player also enjoys themselves. Anyway, we are now nearing the end of this video. Thanks so much for watching. If you want to support this channel, please consider subscribing. I appreciate every subscriber. Also, feel free to comment if you agreed or disagreed with anything I discussed, as I love hearing what you guys have to say. I hope you enjoyed, so have a good day as always.